Good afternoon and welcome to today's Planning Committee. This is not a public meeting but a meeting the public can attend. I'm Councillor Neil Wood, Chair of the Planning Committee. Before we commence, I would like to outline the domestic arrangements for the meeting. We are not expecting a fire practice today. If the alarm sounds, please leave the building by the way of the fire exit through the doors at the left. When you've left the chamber, proceed down the stairway and exit through the emergency exit and to the ground floor. If there's anybody with mobility issues, please wait in the refuge area at the top of the stairs where the emergency evacuation lift is located and use the intercom situated to the left-hand side of the doors to call for assistance. The designated assembly point is currently on the Chamber Road to the rear and other side of the Civic office. I think that's because there's something happening outside. I would like to inform members of the public and press that today's meeting will be audio-visually recorded. By entering the council chamber, you accepted you will be recorded and your images retained and broadcast by the council on its website and on YouTube. If anyone intends to record or film any part of today's meeting, please ensure that this does not disturb the conduct of the meeting and you only focus on recording those people participating. Please ensure that your mobile phones are switched off or switched to silent. Thank you. May I remind anyone speaking in the meeting that you will need to press a large rectangular button underneath the microphone. This will ensure you are recorded. Press it again when you've finished speaking. The meeting is proceeding today on the basis that all members of the committee have read their agenda papers fully and are aware of what they will be considering today. If any members of the committee leave the chamber during consideration of application, they should ensure they do not take part in the vote on their return, as they will not have heard all the relevant information on that particular item. Thank you. So item number 1 is apology for absence. I've only received apology from Councillor Carr and everybody else is here, so that's good. Item 2, exclusion of the public and press. There are no exempt items on today's agenda. Item 3, declaration of interest. Does anyone wish to declare an interest in an item of business on today's agenda, please? Right, brilliant. Bob?
I'm the ward councillor for Bawtry. So.
Cheers, Bob. Item 4, minutes of the Planning Committee meeting held on 30th of June 2026. Can the minutes be moved as a true and accurate record? Seconded. Thank you. That's agreed. Item number 5, schedule of applications. We've got one item on our agenda today and it's application 26/01037/FULM, erection of buildings and sports pitches to form a football training centre with elite professional and community facilities, including user and staff accommodation and ancillary facilities, with associated landscaping, access and parking at land north of Martin Grange Farm, Bawtry. Dave Richards is the planning officer who will introduce this item. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. This application proposes the development of a elite training centre, a professional training centre and an academy with on a 15-hectare site within the Greenbelt. The scheme includes 5 full-size playing pitches, a show pitch with a 499 seat stand, a covered pitch, paddle courts, accommodation, and as Chair says, the ancillary buildings, landscaping, drainage and access works. The proposal is a resubmission of an application previously considered and refused by Planning Committee in February. Members refused on 2 grounds. First, the proposal constituted inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, causing harm by reasons of inappropriateness and harm to the openness of the Greenbelt. And then second, members determined that the operational noise and disturbance from the facility would unacceptably harm the residential amenity of the occupiers of Martin Grange Cottage and Ravenglade. Committee concluded that the cumulative harms of the development outweighed the benefits. So with the resubmission, what has changed, first, in terms of the resubmission, it's broadly identical to the previous submission, but directly addresses the residential amenity issues that led to the earlier refusal. Most significantly, Martin Grange Cottage and Ravenglade now form part of the application site. The current occupiers have entered into a property purchase agreement with the applicant, withdrawn their objections and submitted letters of support. Neither property will continue to operate as an independent dwelling. Instead, they will both be used strictly as accommodation ancillary to the facility of the training centre. Planning conditions and legal obligations will secure this arrangement, prohibiting independent residential occupation. Because the 2 properties named in the previous refusal will no longer operate as separate dwellings, the previous amenity impact in terms of the reasons for refusal from the first application been resolved, and this obviously represents a material change in the circumstances since committee determined the previous application. What hasn't changed is, or equally important, is the proximity or the location of the site within the greenbelt. The proposal remains inappropriate development and continues to cause harm by definition, alongside both spatial and visual harm to openness. And national policy requires that substantial weight is given to any greenbelt harm. So consequently, the application in terms of national policy should not be approved unless very special circumstances exist that clearly outweigh the harm to the greenbelt and any other harm arising from the scheme. So in terms of the key issue for members is whether the overall planning balance has now shifted, and decide whether one of the principal non-greenbelt harms, which has been addressed as part of this application, materially changes your position. For the benefit of newer members of committee, just briefly go through the site arrangements. The site plan identifies the main components, which I've numbered. To the north is the elite training facility, number 1. That's sited on lower ground and relatively well screened by existing woodland and surrounding topography. To the south is the professional training centre, academy, covered pitch and show pitch from the main operational area there to the south. You see sort of L shape along the southern part of the site in grey. And then Martin Grange Cottage and Ravenglade are located near the centre of the site. So that's 4 and 5. And that's what's proposed to be used as ancillary accommodation now as part of the proposals. Martin Grange Farmhouse remains in the applicant's ownership, and Martin Grange Bungalow at the entrance to the site is the only independent residential property potentially affected. Although the site extends to approximately 15 hectares, you'll see that the actual built development occupies a relatively small proportion of the site, and the remainder of the site obviously occupied by sports pitches, landscaping, drainage ponds, and so on. In terms of residential amenity on the resubmission, the application is again supported by a full suite of technical assessments covering noise, lighting, privacy, outlook, daylighting and overshadowing impacts. The environmental health officer has raised no objections subject to planning conditions. As I mentioned, Martin Grange Bungalow is now the only remaining independent residential property, and again the technical evidence concludes that lighting, noise and other amenity impacts remain within accepted standards. This isn't to conclude that there will be no impact, but this was considered with the original application, and living conditions at this property would remain acceptable. In terms of highways and access, the local highway authority or the transportation officer both have no objections to the scheme, and the application is supported by a comprehensive transport assessment. The development includes a number of highway works which are listed to you there. In addition, a financial contribution secures upgrades to nearby bus stops. The transport assessment, in summary, demonstrates that the junction and the wider road network will continue to operate within capacity. Any peak demand or event day traffic will be managed through an event management plan secured by planning condition. Members will note that the LFA, the lead local flood authority, maintains an objection, and drainage remains a key consideration. By way of context, the site is entirely within flood zone 1, which is the lowest category of flood risk, and obviously noting that drainage wasn't a reason for refusal in itself with the previous submission, and the current application is essentially the same drainage strategy. The outstanding concerns relate to 2 specific matters, which I've listed here as 2 issues. First is, even with maximum on-site storage provided, it remains to be demonstrated that a peak discharge rate at 32 litres per second is acceptable, given concerns over downstream capacity within the wider Bawtry catchment. Second, the LFA have raised concerns regarding the long-term ownership, adoption and maintenance of the drainage infrastructure when it's located outside the application site and how it connects to the sewer network. So in answer to that, in terms of how it's controlled, obviously granting plan permission does not exempt the applicant from proving that the drainage strategy is acceptable. And just to briefly touch on how the site is currently, so rainfall obviously drains naturally from the site into the catchment area where it sits. In terms of planning policy, the applicant is required to ensure that the completed development was not increase the surface water runoff rate from the site. To achieve this, the drainage strategy relies on a greenfield runoff rate, which is essentially this 32 litres per second figure. The submitted scheme achieves this requirement by incorporating approximately 1.4 hectares of on-site attenuation storage, in addition to some other sustainable drainage methods such as swales, permeable paving, and so on. Condition 7 secures these measures by requiring the applicant to submit a foul and surface water drainage scheme before the council approves any development, for submission to the council, which should be approved by the council before any development takes place. That submission will include the final drainage design, hydraulic calculations, discharge rates, long-term maintenance arrangements, and any third-party agreements necessary to carry out the drainage strategy that's been proposed. Crucially, if the applicant cannot demonstrate that runoff will be controlled to the agreed greenfield rate and flood risk will not be increased on or off-site, Condition 7 will not be able to be discharged and the development can no longer lawfully commence. And then just turning to the second issue in terms of maintenance, the council has made it clear to the applicant that they will not be adopting private drainage infrastructure or highway pumping infrastructure in the highway, and the applicant accepts this position. Discussions regarding potential future adoption by Severn Trent Water can take place through the relevant statutory process alongside the detailed design stage. Ultimately, again, with the maintenance liabilities for the drainage infrastructure, the developer must prove through the discharge of planning conditions that satisfactory operational maintenance and management arrangements are in place. And if they fail to do that, then the conditions will not be discharged. They cannot lawfully commence development. Just in terms of community use and something that's been touched on previously, the community package today is legally binded and secured through both a 106 agreement and a community use agreement submitted in draft as part of the application, which will be secured. This is a formal enforceable obligation. The legal agreement lists a number of measures here which are shown, including the minimum of 40 hours per week of guaranteed community access. This encompasses dedicated provision for things like schools, disability football teams, walking groups and so on, as well as access to indoor facilities for wider community educational and health use. To address concerns about affordability and the impact on existing facilities, the agreement contains explicit pricing controls that cap user charges at local authority rates, and this is subject to being governed by a joint working group, including the council and partner organisations. This oversight includes mandatory annual monitoring, defined remedial action process if obligations aren't met, and the inclusion of a community lead within the development to actively engage local groups and drive participation. In terms of other technical matters, once again, it's supported by the comprehensive range of technical assessments. Following consultation, the consultees raised no objections, subject to securing appropriate conditions and obligations. What was raised regarding air quality, members should note the note circulated on your pre-committee amendment notes here. The air quality officer has confirmed no objections subject to an additional mitigation condition concerning cost damage assessment. 2 consultee objections remain on file. The first is the LFA, which I've touched on, and then the second is from the council design officer, who may contain concerns regarding the scale, massing and prominence of certain elements of the scheme, particularly the professional training centre, so that's the southern part of the site. We have considered these concerns and weighed them in the assessment. We conclude that neither objection is sufficient to justify refusal when considered as a whole, and a detailed response to the design officer's comments is set out in 7.27 to 7.61 of the report. Turning to the main issue for the committee is the planning balance. So officers attach substantial negative weight to obviously the greenbelt harm, in addition to moderate weight to the landscape and some residual impacts on Martin Grange Bungalow. Set against these harms are a number of benefits set out here. The strategic sporting need addressed by the scheme, the secured community package, as well as job skills and employment benefits with the proposal. Moderate weight is also given to the functional suitability of the site, sustainability credentials of the development, and the delivery of biodiversity net gain. So in conclusion, it's necessary to return to the central question, which is considering the harms and the benefits and comparison to the scheme presented in February, whether the reduction in residential amenity or the removal of the amenity question is in support of the application. Whilst the impact on the Greenbelt remains unchanged, obviously the amenity position has changed significantly. In terms of all material planning considerations, the public benefits of the proposal clearly outweigh the identified harm, satisfying the tests of very special circumstances, and therefore officers recommend planning permissions granted subject to the 3 criteria in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Right, we've received a request to speak from Mr Dan Fell, MBE, from the Doncaster Chamber of Commerce in support of the application. This is now your opportunity to address the committee for up to 5 minutes. I'll give you a warning with a minute to go. So it's over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Chair, and sincerely thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee today. It's much appreciated. So, hi everyone. I think I know most of you, but for those who I've not met before, I'm Dan Fell. I'm Chief Executive of Doncaster Chamber of Commerce. We're an organisation that supports and represents businesses and charities here in Doncaster. In addition to that, I have a few extracurricular roles. I'm a non-executive director of Finance for Enterprise, a governor of the Oncologies Group, and a shadow board member of Fly Doncaster. And I think hopefully I can bring a few of those different perspectives to the worldview I have of this development and what it might do for Doncaster. The first thing I want to do is just share a little bit of the economic context for me. You know, we can all turn on the news and see it is pretty dire times for the economy. We do something called the Quarterly Economic Survey in this last 3 months. The results are pretty grim reading. Only 23% of respondents say sales have increased this last quarter. Only 32% expect profitability to increase in the next 12 months. That's the worst we've seen since the global financial crash, worse than the pandemic. You know, business confidence is absolutely at rock bottom at the moment. We also have probably within sort of 300 local authority areas in this country, very, very sadly, we're probably in the bottom 20 for youth unemployment here in Doncaster. And whilst I'm a big proponent of Team Doncaster ethos and fiercely proud of what we've achieved as a collective this last 10, 20 years, in all honesty, self-reflection, I'd say our track record on economic development, particularly if you look at what's happened in, say, Barnsley City Centre or the Advanced Manufacturing Park in Rotherham, is good, not great. The conclusion of that, we badly need economic stimulus for our economy. We badly need to create a pipeline of jobs for the next generation. You know, clearly as a partnership, we're working on that through projects like Doncaster Sheffield Airport. That's huge, can be really catalytic, but it can't be the only egg in our basket when it comes to our sort of blended portfolio of economic development and in terms of creating that diversity economy that gives us resilience and strength in the future. So from our hilltop, very grateful for the investors for kind of coming forward, looking at Doncaster, picking Doncaster for this proposition. It could have been anywhere in the country, so it's great that it's coming here. Great that there's that real sincere ambition to put Doncaster on the map as the place that is famous for these kind of things. And I think it's also really noteworthy that this is a scheme that's coming forward with entirely sort of private investment. You know, there's not something that's calling for sort of public match or anything of that nature. And that's quite rare for an opportunity of this nature here in South Yorkshire. What that amounts to, from my side, big opportunity here for the visitor economy, big opportunity here for leisure and sport, clearly links to kind of skills and development opportunities, and in the short term, significant supply chain opportunities for our kind of construction sector, which is really vibrant here in Doncaster. That's 200 short-term jobs, 50 in the fullness of time, and that really isn't to be sneezed at in the economic context. Really heartened by some of the stakeholder engagement I've seen, that desire to connect with us and other kind of influential people in the locale, particularly in that education and skills space. You know, we've heard positive feedback from one of our leading charities, Active Fusion, who do great stuff in that space, and also sort of the Oncology is exploring those kind of synergies and that opportunity for learners to engage with this sort of flagship development. You know, and what I can see from my sort of engagement with this, and I'll declare now, I know absolutely chuff all about football, as anyone will tell you, but I absolutely see it as one of those kind of great kind of working class kind of escape routes and opportunities for kind of young people. You know, this really does align well with the borough's sort of economic plan, our health and wellbeing plan, and our kind of education and skills ambitions. You know, so for me, you know, I'm all in favour of this scheme. We've got good member sentiment on that, and I hope that we make Doncaster famous as a place that sort of listens to the officer recommendations, listens to the expertise, and backs sort of really aspirational projects of this nature. That's me done, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And now ask committee members if they wish to ask Dan any questions. Bob's first, then you, Jed.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for that. You spoke about the local economy a lot, and I get the job side of it, which I'll come on to a bit later. So when you talk about that, how do you see this benefiting towns like Bawtry, the hotels, the shops? What benefits do you think they'll gain, and in which way? Thank you.
No, thanks for that. And it's a good question, because there's always jeopardy with change on these things. And so, you know, with anything like this, when we lend our weight, you know, we don't just do it on a knee-jerk thing. We talk to the people and the businesses on the coalface who would have a worldview on this. So we've spoken to the Bawtry Retail Association, those kind of anchor businesses in Bawtry, like the Crown and so forth. And I think it's been unanimous that I've heard that's sort of in support of this project. And I think what they see is confidence that comes with the development of this. It's something to be proud of in the backyard. It's sort of, you know, it's a bit of a trite phrase and probably a bit too sceptical if I know putting us on the map, because we've been promised that before, but it really, really could do in terms of the kind of partnerships that these guys are bringing to the table. I see that creating opportunities for jobs. That's sort of at all kinds of sort of tiers in the organisation. Some of that will be very elite, very kind of skilled work. I imagine there'll be other stuff in the mix that's kind of a bit more accessible for different communities. And then I think there's kind of supply chain opportunities with this as well. Some of that will be the construction side of things, but some of that will be the fullness of time. You know, it's kit, it's food and beverage, it's, you know, all the kind of stuff that goes into making a destination work. So, you know, I struggle to think of sort of a sector that doesn't benefit in some way, even if it's only like a dotted line kind of connection.
Jed, have you got any questions?
Yeah, it's a good idea what you've got, but what I look at, will it have a knock-on effect from other sporting venues that we have in Doncaster, such as Goals, Cantley Park, where the football pitches are, where they're rented out? Would they lose the business? Because if we send everybody, if everybody decides to go out there where that complex is, we could see Goals getting shut down because everybody's going out there. Jobs lost. And same for, and I'm just mentioning too, there's other venues where the soccer's held that could lose out to this complex. Has that been taken into account when you've looked at it?
So it's possibly more of a question for the proposers than me, but my generalised worldview on this is, you know, I represent businesses. I'm a fan of responsible, ethical capitalism. I believe in competition. I believe that makes us all better. I believe it's what makes the world go around. And so I think kind of healthy competition within like an economy makes everyone better. You know, good business wins, poor business doesn't. I think that's okay in life. That's how I'm sort of wired individually. But what I've kind of seen here is a real emphasis on community engagement, on partnership, and trying to sort of blur at the edges of other organisations rather than kind of trample all over kind of toes and displace stuff. I think one of the other things I would say is, you know, I think the way Doncaster's come on this last 10, 20 years, not everyone in this committee I'm sure has this worldview, but like the local authorities have to do quite a lot of heavy lifting in that space, and the council, for example, is still quite engaged in that kind of health and well-being space. What this might create the opportunity to do as the private sector steps in and pays for things and puts resources on, is for the public purse to step away a little bit perhaps from that space and redeploy that to things that only local authorities can do. You know, so I think, you know, when there's any positive change, I think there's the opportunity to look at the system, do a bit of rationalisation and kind of see who's best placed to do things.
Anyone else got questions? Can I ask a question? Why have you decided to turn up with this application but you never come in February?
Good question. I think, you know, I've spoken up charitably with these guys about their stakeholder engagement. But if I'm really honest, apologies, James, because you sat next to me, it was a bit late in the day. And I think, you know, I've said to James, I wish you'd have engaged with us earlier. We could have helped with some of those introductions to potential partners. We could have kind of developed some of those relationships, and I think helped these guys kind of land in a slightly better position first time round. You know, that's hindsight is what it is. You know, we've joined the party a little bit late, but I think hopefully added value to these guys to get them engaged into a business community and places who will explore those partnerships and bring the slightly esoteric things I've described around supply chain opportunities and whatnot to life in a real and tangible way.
Excuse me, Chair. Sorry, am I able to respond to the previous question from the member? I'm a registered speaker. Right?
It's not your turn. You'll be next. You're an applicant, aren't you?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Dan. Just finish off what you said.
Yeah, so I think for me, I'm a fan of this, but I'm a fan of it who came to the party late, to be all honest, Chair. So having sort of learned more about the developments in the latter stages, and to be honest with you, being a bit worried by the previous decision about what that said in terms of Doncaster's view of professional expertise, because I know the recommendation was to approve, being a bit worried about the fact we were being seen as a place that was saying no to 200 short-term jobs, given the dryness of the economy. It felt like a bit of intervention and support was needed.
Just an observation for me, when you say late, it was yesterday that you were put to me to be a meeting here. It might be an idea to keep in touch with planning, because these guys know what's going forward, so we're not in this position next time, but we'll give you opportunity to speak, and I think applicants will appreciate what you've said already. Has anybody else got? Rob?
Hi, Dan. You said in your opening speech that, you know, it's not often that purely private investment such as this for a large-scale development comes to Doncaster. Does the ambition of that sort of give confidence to the business community going forward about sort of, we're in a tricky time now, but with this development, could that be beneficial for Doncaster's business community going forward?
Yeah, it's a good question, Rob. I think two things I'd say in response to that, which is, you know, modelling good behaviour always helps. Actually, the fact that something like this that's of significance could kind of, you know, get over the line purely with that private sector support, I think challenges that assumption that sort of big things need to be sort of pumped prime by the public sector in some way, shape or form. And actually there's kind of proof of concept that this can probably be done faster, possibly even better as a kind of consequence of that. And I think that's really helpful kind of signal, because the local authority then has a comparator it can point to and says, well, this is happening without that kind of need for, you know, very detailed sort of investment and engagement. So like, why do you need it kind of piece on that. Bulk, so I would say there are quite a few eyes from the business committee on this decision. You know, like this is, you know, we all know football is something that people engage with, people are interested in. It's a bit more newsworthy than perhaps, say, another planning decision. And there are influential people in business from a range of sectors who are a bit mystified by the previous decision and a bit worried about what it said about Doncaster. And so, like, there is a little bit of reputational kind of risk and therefore opportunity associated with today's decision. And Chair, thank you for the rebuke on diary management. My colleagues will be very pleased with that. They'll be glad it's on record.
Anyone else got before we go on to the applicant? Right, thanks for that, Dan. So we received a request to speak from Mr. Charles Dunn. I think he's been here before. You've got 5 minutes to speak. I'll give you a warning with a minute to go. Over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Firstly, apologies for my interjection before. I hadn't quite worked out where we were at in the agenda, and apologies for my lateness as well. Cross-country and northern almost managed to stop me getting here at all, so a sprint from the stations warmed me up nicely. Anyway, as you've said, good afternoon, and yeah, my name's Charles Dunn. I'm the agent for this application. As I imagine you will have discussed, most members, I believe, are hopefully familiar with the scheme, with it being a resubmission of the scheme considered earlier in the year, as has been referenced. That being the case, the first and most important point I'd like to make is that the applicant has listened really carefully to the concerns that were previously raised and has worked really, really hard to successfully address them. As you guys know, the reasons for refusal were greenbelt impacts and, of course, the relationship between the scheme and the neighbouring dwellings at Martin Grange Cottage and Ravenglade. As the officer has, what I expect, has explained, that position is now completely changed. Those two properties are now a part of the application, no longer separate, not proposed to remain as independent dwellings at all, and instead they will be in a restricted use as ancillary short stay accommodation for the operational purposes of the scheme. As a result, as part of the proposals, these buildings will no longer be homes, and the amenity relationship in planning terms that members were previously concerned about, quite rightly, is completely resolved. I'd like to reiterate as well that what has enabled this is a mutual agreement reached between the applicant and the owner-occupiers of the adjacent properties. As you know, they've withdrawn their previous objection and in fact submitted a letter in support of the application, as they do recognise the huge benefits that the scheme will bring to Bawtry and to Doncaster. With respect to the Greenbelt point, it's acknowledged that, of course, any new building in this context will have an impact on the openness of the Greenbelt. Although in this case, I'd like to stress the fact that the site is not untouched or unspoiled countryside. It's been developed in the past and in various uses, including as an airfield historically, as well as the existing football academy use that is ongoing on site. With that in mind, we're not here today asking members to ignore the question of the Greenbelt, but to keep the history of the site in mind alongside the comprehensive, very special circumstances policy case that officers are fully supportive of, and the very substantial benefits of the scheme, including a significant community use commitment. To partly address one of the members' previous questions that I was able to hear, this community use would not compete with, stress, or detract from existing council facilities. Far from it, actually. The community use and the access that has been worked through and enabled and committed to in the scheme has been specifically put together in partnership with the council to address where the council's own evidence base identifies that there are gaps in local provision. That's informed by a detailed pitch assessment. So, as proposed, it's not, although I agree with the fellow speaker's point about the benefits of competition in a given industry or marketplace, in this case, what's proposed in terms of community use is specifically to fill gaps that exist, to improve that provision and not compete with any existing facilities in the area. To quickly touch on a couple of specific technical points as well, I'd like to reassure members that there's a clear drainage solution that's ready to be agreed, subject to further detailed design. It's not proposed to impose any extra surface water runoff onto council systems or ask that the council adopt any new drainage assets. There has been engagement with Severn Trent Water, and this arrangement needs to be fully agreed after planning permission has been put in place, hopefully. In summary then, the proposal would deliver a nationally significant football training campus for Doncaster, alongside a really substantial set of commitments and a community use package that's been carefully put together in partnership with officers and with consultees. The scheme represents tens of millions of pounds of investment into the local economy, delivering jobs, skills, local supply chain benefits, visitor economy spend, highway improvements, sustainable design credentials, extensive tree planting and biodiversity net gain. The officers weighed all these matters carefully and rightly, we think, concludes that the benefits clearly weigh in favour of granting planning permission. So we respectfully ask members to accept the officer recommendation to grant permission. I'd be grateful for any questions anyone might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Does any members of the committee want to ask any questions? Bob first.
Thank you for that. I know it touches on them in reports, but I like to hear it. How many local jobs do you think will be created through this scheme if it gets planning permission?
You're testing me now. There are upwards of 50, 60 during the construction phase and a little less than that then permanently once it's operational. That's full-time equivalent on site, and those sort of have multiplier effects once you're talking about some wider supply chain impacts. But I don't recall those exact figures, unfortunately.
If it got planning permission, I know you talk about it being elite, which is great, but obviously we want to see community use, and I know it touches on it in here, but how much community use will it be used for? How many schools? Will schools get the opportunity, and obviously will it be affordable?
Yeah, so in terms of the extent of access, it's circa 40 hours a week. So in practice, in terms of when you're thinking about when people and kids are actually going to have the time to get on there, peak hours and that sort of a thing, it's effectively one of the pitches on the site is, in essence, in reality, is going to be permanently allocated for that community use, just due to the amount of hours dedicated, and that's firm commitment set out in the heads of terms that's been agreed with officers to go into the Section 106 agreement. In terms of schools and access, yeah, another element of that 106 agreement is the commitment for the provision for a dedicated member of staff within the centre whose whole purpose will be ensuring that that community access and use is facilitated and enabled and knitted in the right way with the sort of elite and professional aspects of the site as well. So essentially a full-time role has been committed to make that happen. And in terms of affordability, again, another element of the legal agreement heads of terms that have been agreed is to cap those rates so that at the very max they are equivalent to the council's own facilities.
When the elite players and that come, will there be an opportunity for the community to see elite players training, that sort of thing? Will they get access to that?
To see elite players training is something that I'm not in a position to confirm, sat here right now to confirm that, because ultimately that is going to be a question of operational details that I can't honestly say yes right now. But what we can commit to, because it's much more normal part of this sort of thing, is that there will be outreach into schools and the community for those players to go out. Getting kids onto the elite side of the site is a different matter that I can't commit to right now.
Steve's next.
Thank you. A very quick one. If permission is granted, when would you start building, and when would you envisage it being completed and open?
Am I able to defer to my colleague next to me, who is much more in touch with the delivery side of things?
I'm James. Can you hear me right? Sorry. So we are looking to obviously discharge any conditions because we can't commence on site. So I think that would probably take us, what, three months maybe, something like that? A couple of months?
4 or 5. There's a lot to get through.
Okay, so we've got to get through the conditions, but once we've got through that, then we'll commence on site immediately. It's an 18 to 24 month program. So that's the time period.
Rob?
Thanks, Chair. Charles, welcome back. Some of the support that predicates the use of the facility is through letters of support from some pretty big name clubs, including Tottenham Hotspur. Are we calling West Ham a big club? Well, they're included. Bournemouth, Bristol Rovers, Burnley, Newcastle, Norwich, Rangers, Reading, LA Galaxy, Racing Club de Sporting, and a team in Romania. Could you give sort of details of in what circumstance clubs such as that would be using this facility in Doncaster as opposed to their own facilities?
Yeah. Well, we're in the middle, if anyone's does follow football, we're in the middle of that pre-season sort of training time of year where if you follow any of your football clubs on Twitter or anything like that, you no doubt you'll be seeing them pictures of them training in round and about around Europe or up and down the country. That sort of thing, absolutely. In summer is something that aims to, that the scheme aims to provide facilities for. Many European clubs travel to the UK for friendlies, pre-season, that sort of thing. Premier League, Championship teams travelling up and down the country. At the minute, sometimes you see teams get flack for travelling by plane on the day to go to away games, or else they go a day or a night or two beforehand, and often the facilities they might have a really nice hotel, but it's almost unheard of for the right accommodation to be coupled with the right sports and footballing provision for those away travelling teams, which is kind of the basis for most of those UK teams to have expressed their support, because they recognise that when they do travel for away games, which is most of the season, that is 2 sort of away games a week, if we're talking midweek games as well, then the facilities are really, really lacking. And the position of the site, the location of the site within the country is part of the application materials. It's been part of the planning case for VSC, is that there is a really large catchment of Premier League and Championship clubs within reasonable travel distance of the site, which is, it's a conscious choice. It's a deliberate choice because these travelling teams will be able to make use of the facilities, without having to have that overnight travel, and that's more disruptive to game performance and, as we know, elite sport, marginal gains and all of that sort of thing. Every little helps, and that's the basis on which those teams have sought to support the application and express a desire to use it.
Anyone else? How reliant is this proposal on airport opening?
It's not reliant on it at all from a commercial perspective, but clearly there'd be a sort of help reciprocal either way. It would be beneficial to the airport, and it would benefit from the airport being open.
Anyone else? Officers want to expand on anything that's been discussed? No? Right, does any committee members want to go into a debate with officers? Rob first.
Dave, I'm surprised Steve hasn't mentioned his favourite thing, drainage.
I ain't got a chance, you go there first.
Oh, well, boo-hoo. Condition 7, it's good that there's the assurance in there for the plan and scheme of works to be presented to the council and to be checked over before development commences. But is there any scope to widen that condition to include post-completion as well, to ensure that work has taken place and it does bring the surface runoff benefits that we want to see?
Good question, and it's something officers grappled with in informing the wording of that condition. On the one hand, it's a post check is would be useful to understand, exactly what's been agreed in principle, and then through the submission of detailed plans and so on, that's actually been carried out. The flip side to that is when forming conditions, we have to ensure they meet certain tests, and one of them is sort of reasonableness, enforceability, and not only through this application but with others, sometimes what's come a cropper at appeal is inspectors have took the view that post sort of checks fail those tests because essentially the detail that's provided to the LPA with the submission of the conditions package is there on paper. It shows the detailed technical specifications, the hydraulic calculations, even down to pipe sizes, everything, and that forms part of the approved plans. And essentially inspectors have said that LPA should rely on them as the source of truth, as opposed to carrying out further checks, post permission. So there's something that we did grapple with in terms of the wording of that condition, but ultimately we have to rely on the approved plans as the source of truth, and there's a separate enforcement mechanism if it becomes apparent that it's not being built in accordance with what's been agreed. Having said that, ultimately we can take a look at the wording of the condition. We have colleagues from drainage with us today if we can think of any technical requirements to facilitate that. But just to explain in terms of forming the condition why we've shied away from any sort of post-development checks, because it's been pulled apart in various appeals in applications past. Separate to that, and in alluded to this and others have as well, in addition to the planning requirements of the planning condition, there's a completely separate regime that makes sure, for example, through Severn Trent Water, that when an asset is proposed for adoption, it's done to their technical standards. And I imagine they will apply the same degree of rigour to ensure that the details they're provided with are then carried out. And as with most things, before they adopt something, they want to see what's built. So they may have their own regime on checking that infrastructure is built in accordance with what's been agreed. But just to make the point here, there is a separate regime who will do their own checks to make sure what's been put in is sufficient.
Steve?
Thank you. What would the enforcement process look like? Because you said there's a separate regime. What does that look like?
Well, in terms of how the conditions worded, the premise of what the presentation was saying is essentially there's two aspects to what details we need for this development. The first is that the catchment of Bawtry has obviously the rainwater flows into the area, flows onto the ground, and eventually ends up at certain sources, discharges into rivers, watercourses, and so on. And ultimately, the key requirement for this application, and it's that magic 32 litres per second figure, that's the greenfield rate. So as it stands currently, rainfall falling onto that site equates to that figure. And what the details will need to demonstrate is that whatever surface water is flowing into the network doesn't exceed that same figure. Because if it ultimately is, and what they need to demonstrate through the drainage condition is that it's all part of the same catchment, so they're not adding to existing water pressures in the area. So there's a step process for the applicants to go away and do further work, hydraulic modelling and hydraulic work with their drainage consultants to demonstrate that the water that is disposed onto the field will end up in the same place as if it was piped there. It's trying to put it in plain English terms. So in terms of enforcing that, colleagues in the LFA will have scrutiny of what the hydraulic calculations, what's submitted to us, and they're the technical experts, I guess, in demonstrating that there's no increase then in surface water risk to the area because essentially the water's ending up in the same place anyway. The enforcement angle probably is more of a hypothetical because we're going beyond what's been presented. Again, we presume, or we don't presume, we expect the developer to build what's been agreed through those drainage conditions. And as an aside, I can't see why they wouldn't want to build what would be ultimately agreed, because then they'd be liable for enforcement action on a hugely significant scheme with a lot of investment. So I don't really want to hypothesize on what will happen if enforcement action is required. It's a separate process, but as you know, it will be a case of scrutinizing what's been agreed versus the amount of drainage attenuation on the site, the network, and then ultimately what's been discharged off-site and whether that fits with the approved plans, and then coming to a view as to whether that's whether there's a public interest argument to then enforce if that's proven to be incorrect. I think that possibility is very small, but ultimately that process is there separate to make sure that it's there if it's needed.
Steve.
Thanks, Dave. I mean, it's interesting to look at the completion date of, let's say, around 29. Now, we've also know that there are other applications pending and some have been granted. The impact on water is huge, and the flow for that water is huge in and around the area. Now, how do we know that the figures and things, we know the discussion within the red line will affect just that. But as you've just said there, the full-on impact of it all affects the whole community, not just this one. So this one might be running water towards, let's say, towards Torn. It will be using ditches, which are maintained by farmers, everybody else that maintain them. Maybe they don't maintain them anymore. Maybe they've given up and gone away. How do we make sure that all of this works as it should, and how do we keep an eye on it, which Emma knows that there are other ones, that the Environment Agency have been asked to have a look. It's been like pulling teeth with them, but it is the impact of all of that on such a vast site with big planning applications all around this area. So how are we going to keep an eye on this if, as you've said, enforcement is hypothetical? It just doesn't make any sense to me. But if you can show some light, Dave, that'd be great.
Well, strictly I want to make sure we were concentrating on this application. It's acknowledged that there's wider issues in the area in terms of surface water drainage into that sort of catchment. And I guess I don't want to repeat myself, but the point from this site, making sure that conditions are enforceable, is that the applicant needs to demonstrate that they're not increasing that risk off-site, fundamentally. And if that's the case, and that's why the conditions worded as such, is until we can get that assurance, then development can't commence on the site. So yeah, that's 3 months for in terms of discharging planning conditions. There's a lot of work for the applicant to do in those 3 months to achieve that standard. They're going to have to do the various technical assessments, present them to the council with advice from the LFA to demonstrate that that catchment area remains the same. I don't know if Richard wants to just jump in on sort of any context on the wider area and the issues around Bawtry and how the LFA look to manage that. That would be appreciated.
Yes, thanks, Dave. Firstly, could I address the point about post-construction inspection? I know that's something that you've mentioned a couple of times. By normal convention, a lot of the drainage is already buried. So one of the things we can't do is you start digging up some chambers to make sure they're laid in the right place and things like that. But one of the things we can do as a lead local flood authority, if the applicant was happy to submit some as-built drawings, we could do the compliance check after that to make sure the approved plans and the as-built are similar. It's a desktop study, unfortunately, so we don't get on site. And we can certainly do that compliance check if that would be helpful, Dave. In terms of checking that the water is not going to cause problems downstream, that's something that we were initially concerned about. We were worried that it might be a catchment transfer. And what we normally receive is a hydrology report. So that sets out where the water goes, how it's going to get there, and what litre per second is entered into that catchment. And that shows a virtual simulation as to what happens with the chambers, if water's coming out of chambers and things like that. So we would get a visual representation as a lead local flood authority to look at that hydrology report and be satisfied. And once we are satisfied, we can put forward conditions and things like that. So that would be my take on those 2 points. Thank you.
Are you happy with this development and what's proposed?
Thank you. We don't have an opinion on that. Once we receive an application, we do a compliance check on it. At the moment, there's a few questions that are left unanswered, we feel, through the flood risk assessment. And I think if we were given a bit more time with the applicant, if this committee was a little bit later, would have addressed those concerns. But they remained outstanding, and that's why we put an objection in detail. It's quite important to note that detail rather than in principle. Thank you.
Anyone else got any questions? Just from my point, we're calling it a green belt all the time, and we've got this grey belt element. If it's been developed before, how come it's green belt, not grey belt?
Thanks, Chair. I'll try and condense Greenbelt policy into 2 minutes. In a sense, this site is certainly designated as located within the Greenbelt. And although there's sort of remnants of bits and pieces on the site and previous sort of question and some agricultural uses, there's certain exemptions from what is, for certain sorts of buildings and so on are exempt from being classed as buildings in the Greenbelt for those purposes. So, but essentially what we have ultimately in a planning sense is a site that is fairly free of and devoid of structures, and that's why we've taken a rigorous approach to essentially saying the site is greenbelt, and then this new development will cause an impact to that, both sort of visually and by its definition. In terms of grey belt, there's certain tests for, and I think members had training on that fairly recently, or we're about to have training at some point. But in terms of grey belt tests, one of the sort of key requirements is that there's a functional need for the development, but that's relating to certain criteria, commercial, residential, and so on. Essentially, I haven't covered it too much in the report because essentially it doesn't meet the criteria that's set out in the MPPF for it to be deemed as grey belt land. So this is why we've taken a sort of belt and braces approach. The worst case scenario essentially is that it's green belt, it's relatively undeveloped, and the site will ultimately develop that and weigh against it for that purpose. So. Yeah, in terms of grey belt, it's definitely not, because it doesn't meet the relevant criteria in the MPPF. So that's why they say the assessment really concentrates on green belt.
So basically what we're saying is that green belt is where it's an absolute unnecessary thing that's going to be affected, whereas when you put solar panels on it, it makes it grey belt. Anybody else got up to add? Dave?
Dave, if I may ask, of the 15 hectares, proportionately, what has traditionally been in hectare proportion been built or used prior to this application?
try and just bring up the site plan again, which frames this perhaps better. So in terms of the existing development, it's essentially that central compound. You've got Martin Grange farmhouse, you've got this sort of ancillary outbuildings, stables in that sort of horseshoe complex. Then you've got 3 residential properties, Martin Grange bungalow, 457, yes, a more eloquent way of putting it. And then essentially the dark grey elements are new development as part of this proposal. So you've got obviously the main 2 principal buildings, the PTC, the Professional Training Centre to the north, and the Elite Training Facility to the north, and then the show pitch and Professional Training Centre to the south. The elements to the west side there, that's the general maintenance area, so that's storage of machinery, materials, etc. And then you've got the entrance gate, sort of security arrangements around the site, and car parking. It's a landscaping plan, so architects always like to paint everything green and pretend nothing's been built, but hopefully you'll be able to see the sort of ratio of built development on the site is still fairly low. It's still development in the green belt, so again, the worst case scenario is that it's inappropriate, but you know, fundamentally a lot of the site will remain sort of undeveloped, albeit it's covered in plain pitches, floodlights and so on.
Thank you. In retrospect then, it's pro-rata, probably about 10 hectares that are affected. Again, talking to the water effects running off from that, in addition to the existing 5 hectares already accommodated for.
Yeah, the site, you know, in sense of the playing pitches, the landscaping, the drainage attenuation, the developers tried to maximise the amount of on-site attenuation, so that's use of permeable paving, you know, the drainage attenuation that's proposed to try and keep it in the site as much as they can. But the buildings are significant in size, and that means that's why the runoff, you know, from those buildings needs to be captured and discharged appropriately. So, yeah, if it's like the undeveloped areas, there's best efforts there to try and keep the drainage of that within the site.
Anyone else got it? Just on the statement for support for the scheme, that's from the, I'm guessing the residents of 4 and 5, whatever it is. When you look at it, a lot of it's redacted. Is the redacted stuff just pure personal information? Anybody else got out them? Right then, let's see if we can sort out an agreement. So, is there a proposal to grant planning permission? Well, same. If you want to keep debating, Rob, you go. Rob.
Sorry, I'll save it to the end because it's not a question. I know that Dan's contribution said about, from the business community, it didn't make sense, a previous decision by the committee in terms of the business community because we weren't listening to professionals. My view at the time during the application was that the application came forward without listening to humans. When you've got those 2 properties in the middle, that were an island in the middle of this mass sporting facility, if I was a resident, I would not accept that, so I wouldn't certainly put forward anything for that to happen to anyone else. And so that's why on that vote I abstained, and I do think it's right that the applicant took that feedback back, went away, discussed with the property owners, and effectively bought them out to bring it for this application, because it will benefit the city economically. It just didn't make sense in the application that came forward at that point. I thought it's important to make that statement in light of sort of this new application. Thank you.
So just to be clear, has anybody else got to say about this application before we make a decision? Right then, make a decision. Is there a proposal to grant planning permission subject to the imposition of planning conditions? Is there a mover? Rob. Seconder. Isaiah. Bob. Any increase on 3? Right then, we've had enough to move it forward. So can I see a show of hands for everybody in favour of this application? Seven, 4. Everybody against? None against, and those who are abstaining? 3 abstain. So, members, ladies and gentlemen, that means we've granted planning permission for 26/01037 FUF LM. Thank you for that. Item 7, appeal decisions. The report's for information only. However, I know Emma's going to just have something to say on this before we have all to say ourselves.
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep it brief, but you've not heard from me today, so I didn't want to go the whole meeting without saying anything to you. Just to flag another really good month in terms of our appeal records. So all of the appeals we've reported this time round were dismissed, so showing really robust decision making by the council, which is great to see. One appeal decision that's not on your papers because we only received it yesterday from the planning inspectorate is the decision around the expansion of Goffs, which was considered by the committee last August. The appeal's been dismissed, so the inspector agreed with the planning committee's ground of refusal in that case. What I will do after this meeting is send that decision to you all so you can see it. It'll be in the papers in the normal way next month, but I know that it was a decision that you very carefully considered and felt very strongly about, so I wanted to let you know sooner rather than later that that decision had come through. Thank you, Chair.
Anyone else want to say up? I'm just going to say something. We knew about the new planning changes that are going to take place end of October. I've asked Emma to try and put together for next meeting some information to, one, show us how it would have affected us starting from, say, start of August, just to give us an idea how it is going to affect us moving forward. But also, I'm putting forward that we would put a bit of a debate into this session that puts into public realms of what the problems are going to be for us, what it's going to be for public, and just so that everybody understands that while there's changes being made, they're above our heads, and what the effects are going to be on them people, because you're all giving it in all your different wards that planning permission for 200 houses, and there's already too many houses here, or we want to put a bird sanctuary in, and we don't need birds in this village, or wherever it's going to be. We need to be clear that it's going to be took out of our hands and how it is going to be affecting Doncaster residents in the future, because I certainly don't want to be part and parcel of the torment that I want to try and maintain a good standard. I know you guys all do, and I know this team down here do, but it's unfortunately been took out of hands, so we're going to try and make it before the end of October, we said, didn't we? We've got 3 more planning sessions before the end of October. So we'll try and identify how it's going to affect us, how it's going to affect people of Doncaster, and also what it means in terms of the applications we're getting and how it's going to affect it. A lot of people don't realise that we used to have a 6.2 year plan for build, and now it's gone down to 3.9 because goalposts have been changed. We've allowed in excess of, I'm sure, 1,800 houses in the last 12 months, and as a result of passing off more houses than what our target was, we're still going to be in an area where we're classed as needing help to find places to build houses. And I think it's unfair on what we do as a team to try and get things moving forward and make Doncaster develop, to then be put into a place where it looks like we need special help, and we know that we don't. So I'm just emphasise again, planning team hopefully is going to come on that one.
Yeah, Chair, so we've got some sessions booked in with officers and members to talk about how we deal with the national scheme of delegation in practice, and we're starting to compile ideas about how that will look, so how members can still be involved in the process, because that was something that you as a committee were very keen to ensure that we were still doing, given that ward members won't have a right of call-in anymore, but there are ways to make sure that members are being engaged properly in the planning process. So we've got those sessions set up. We're also planning to, as Chair says, bring reports to you to formally and publicly debate those to make sure that it's as good as it can be, ready for the implementation date of the 31st of October. What I would say is, just referring back to the earlier comment about the Goffs decision, I think that was always one that would have come to committee regardless of whether the national scheme was in place. So I want you to worry that that would have otherwise been a delegated decision. And when we did the exercise earlier this year around the proportion of applications we would have still reported to committee, there were only a handful that would have had to be delegated to officers as opposed to come before you. So my hope is that once we've fleshed out what the practical implications of this are, you won't necessarily notice a huge change in what's coming forward to committee. There might be some, but I'm hopeful that we'll have a robust scheme that we can take forward and work within those parameters, because yes, you're right, they're being imposed on us, they're being imposed in every council across the country, but we can put measures in place to make sure that it works proportionately for us, and I think we've got a good plan for that, so welcome the opportunity to talk about that in the few months to come. Thank you.
And the only thing I'm going to add to that, well, I think when we had that session 2 months ago when we were putting the consultation in, one of the things we did identify is the best way for us to move forward to make sure that your wards are heard is to try and get the planning guys into the neighbourhood, so the parish councils, where there's a neighbourhood plan, get them involved at that level and let the neighbourhood put the objections through, because we're not going to be able to do it at this sort of level. It's got to come from grassroots, so it's certainly something that we need to be communicating in all our groups to make sure that they understand that it's out of our hands, and they need to make sure that if they've got a problem with it, that they start identifying it. I think it's Armthorpe, 1,200 objections in for an housing estate there. That's a statement, and that's a statement that these guys are going to have to listen to. If they think that we've got the ability to put 1,200 objections in, it's not going to happen. It's definitely down to you guys and your parish members to push that fight if they have got issues. But anyway, I think, can I ask that we move that the report be noted? Seconded. Right. Ladies, gentlemen, boys and girls, that concludes the meeting of today. Thank you very much. See you next month.
Thank you, Chairman.